The village of Usvi was a place tucked away at the edge of the world, where civilization took its last breath. Here in the foothills of the Ural Mountains, where winter lasted 9 months of the year, life's rhythm was dictated by snow and wind. The smoke rising lazily from the chimneys of the wooden houses would ascend towards the leaden sky, instantly dissolving into the frozen air. The silence was so profound that a distant dog's bark or the creak of a door had the sudden jarring effect of shattering glass. This was the final stop for the Northern Echo Expedition, a team of 7 experienced mountaineers and researchers. Their goal was to be the first to climb the legendary Silent Summit, a peak that appeared only as a white smudge on maps. A place the locals were reluctant to even name, as the team took refuge in the dim warmth of the village's only inn. They momentarily forgot the biting frost of the world outside. Their leader, Victor, was a man in his 40s, his face weathered by wind and sun, calm yet resolute. The rest of the team seated around the table were like him, people who had passed nature's toughest tests. The only differences among them were the geologist Elena, who noted everything with scientific curiosity, and the youngest, Dmitri, with that irrepressible, adventurous spark in his eyes. A few old villagers sitting in the inn watched their modern, brightly colored equipment and confident conversation with a distant curiosity, as if they were creatures from another world. After a while, the innkeeper, an old man named Ivan, whose every wrinkle told the story of another winter, approached their table. As he set down his tray, his eyes fell on the map Victor had spread out. His finger traced the red line marking the route to the summit. "That is not a good place," he murmured, his voice nearly lost in the crackling of the wood stove. "The mountain does not like visitors, especially the Silent Summit." Elena smiled without looking up from her notebook. "Every mountain has its own challenges, Uncle Ivan," she said gently. "We are prepared." Ivan slowly shook his head. "This is not a challenge, you know," he insisted. "This is not a challenge of snow or storm, the mountain speaks. But on that summit, there's only silence. And that silence is more dangerous than the loudest storm. Those who go do not return to tell what they heard. Only the emptiness remains." These words made the other villagers in the inn bow their heads. Victor looked at the old man with respect. "We appreciate your concern," he said, "but we have accepted this risk." "It's just an expedition," Ivan said no more. He simply looked at them with a sorrowful expression, as one would look at travelers heading towards an inevitable end, and slowly returned to his counter. Although the team dismissed these superstitions with a smile, the warmth in the inn seemed to diminish. For a moment, the next morning, even the dawn was not enough to light up the sky. A gray, monotonous light was spread over the village of Usvi like a shroud. As the Northern Echo Expedition made their final preparations in front of the inn, the silence in the village was even deeper than the previous evening. This time there were no curious eyes watching them from the windows. The curtains were drawn tight, the doors bolted. It was as if the entire village was ignoring their departure, afraid of drawing the mountain's wrath upon themselves. Only Ivan stood leaning against the inn's doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, watching them in silence. There was no expression of farewell or goodbye on his face, just the dull, sorrowful gaze of someone waiting for the inevitable. Victor nodded to the old man but received no response. This silent send-off said more than the loudest of goodbyes. As the team left the last house of the village behind and took their first steps into the dense pine forest, the last whisper of civilization was cut off. Now there was only the muffled sound of their steps in the snow, the white vapor of their breath in the air, and the mournful howl of the wind passing through the trees. For the first few hours, everything was normal. The team members moved forward, silently but steadily, with the harmony that came from their experience. Victor led the way. Elena occasionally stopped to take rock samples, and Dmitri tried to immortalize every moment of this untouched whiteness with his camera, However, as they moved deeper into the forest, a strange feeling began to settle over all of them. It was not the feeling of being followed, but rather the feeling of being watched. It was as if the trees themselves, the snow-covered rocks, even the sky, were a giant, silent observer, focused on them, weighing their every step. Just as these thoughts were circulating in their minds, they suddenly stopped. Ahead of them, right in the middle of the path, was a series of tracks in the fresh snow. But these tracks did not belong to a bear, a wolf, or any other known animal. They were huge, almost twice the size of a human's, and strangest of all, there were only 3 of them. A first track, a second, and a third. Then the track simply ended, as if their owner had vanished into the sky. There were no signs of a struggle, no other path leading in another direction. Just those 3 massive, inexplicable tracks, and then the pure, untouched snow. Sergei, the team's most experienced tracker, knelt and examined the tracks. His face was worried. "I don't know any animal like this," he murmured. "And this makes no sense. Nothing can just disappear into the air." Elena immediately took out her notebook and began to sketch the shape of the tracks, taking measurements. She was searching for a scientific explanation, perhaps an erosion pattern created by the wind or the shape of a rock hidden beneath the snow. But every logical explanation she could find felt inadequate against the strangeness of what she saw. While Dmitri photographed the tracks with a mixture of fear and excitement, Victor looked at his team. The confident expressions on their faces had given way to a faint unease. "We're moving on," Victor said, trying to maintain the resolve in his voice. "We can't lose time." They continued to walk, but now their steps were more hesitant. Ivan's words echoed in their minds. "This is not a challenge, you know." The mountain had sent them its first warning dot as the sun began to disappear behind the horizon. The sky turned a deep shade of purple, then black. The team had walked in silence for several more hours after finding the strange tracks and had finally decided to set up their first camp in a sheltered area just below the tree line. Their orange and yellow tents stood out like scars on the white snow. The campfire they lit in the center cast flickering, dancing shadows on the trunks of the giant pine trees around them. Shadows that seemed to come alive with every gust of wind and stretch towards them. The crackling of the fire and the sound of boiling water had, for a moment, dispelled the unsettling silence that had seeped into them throughout the day. But it was a false relief. Everyone could feel that just beyond the small circle of light from the fire, something in the dark forest was watching them. No one was talking about the 3 giant tracks, but the subject hung in the silence around the fire like heavy smoke. It was on everyone's mind. As Sergei whittled a piece of wood with his knife, his eyes kept darting to the darkness of the forest. Elena seemed to be scribbling something in her notebook, but her pen had been motionless on the same page for minutes. Dmitri was fiddling with his camera's settings but not pressing the shutter. It was Victor, as usual, who broke the silence. "The weather looks like it's going to turn tomorrow," he said, without taking his eyes off the fire. "We need to start the climb early. Once we leave the forest behind, we'll face the true nature of the mountain." These words were like opening a floodgate. Dmitri couldn't hold back. "Those tracks," he whispered. "Victor, what do you think they were?" Everyone's gaze turned to Victor. They were expecting a logical, comforting answer from him. Victor threw another log on the fire. Sparks rose into the night and disappeared. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But we are not here to find out what it was. Our mission is to reach the summit. We must be prepared for anything unknown. This is just the beginning." But this answer did not satisfy anyone. Sergei stabbed his knife into the ground. "Ivan was right," he said in a raspy voice. "Something is wrong with this mountain. That wasn't an animal track. It was a warning." Elena finally closed her notebook. "There's a scientific explanation for everything, Sergei," she said. but the confident tone in her voice was gone. Perhaps a geological anomaly, a depression caused by a gas vent under the snow. She couldn't finish her sentence because even she didn't believe what she was saying. At that moment, a thin, high-pitched sound was heard from the darkness just beyond the fire. It wasn't like an animal's cry. It was more like the painful, melodic sound of wind passing over a broken piece of glass. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had come. Everyone froze. Their small, safe space around the fire had then shattered in an instant. They were sure now. They were being watched. And whatever was watching them wanted them to know it was there. After that night, no one spoke a word around the campfire. That thin, sorrowful sound had lingered in the darkness and seeped into their sleep. When morning came, the faces of everyone showed signs of sleeplessness and a suppressed fear. The usual banter, the spirit of camaraderie around the morning coffee, was gone. Everyone packed up the camp silently and mechanically. While folding the tents and packing the gear into their backpacks, everyone's eyes involuntarily drifted to the dark depths of the forest. It was as if the owner of that sound was standing somewhere among the trees, watching them leave. This shared tension was like an unspoken agreement. No one voiced their fear, but everyone saw the same anxiety in each other's eyes. When they left the last tree of the forest behind and took their first steps onto the open slope of the mountain, the view was as overwhelming as it was breathtaking. Before them stretched a massive expanse of white, covered in snow and ice, reaching for the sky. Without the protection of the trees, the wind now hit their faces directly, carrying thousands of tiny ice crystals that felt like sandpaper. This was a world where life could not hold on, a world of only rocks, snow, and sky. And the silence of this world was much deeper than that of the forest. There, at least, was the howl of the wind or the crack of a branch. Here, sound was absorbed into the void and disappeared. As Victor had predicted, the weather began to change rapidly. But this was not like a normal mountain storm. The dark clouds appearing on the horizon did not approach slowly. It was as if the sky directly above them had suddenly been stained with ink. The sun, which had been there a moment before, however faint, was now completely gone. The wind, instead of blowing from a fixed direction, attacked from all sides at once like a living entity trying to throw them off balance. And within that wind, that sound was there again. It was not as clear as the night before. It was more like a whisper mixed with the howl of the wind. But it was there. A sorrowful, melodic, and ancient sound beyond human comprehension. Alina looked at the barometer on her wrist. The needle was dropping at an incredible speed. "This is impossible," she shouted against the wind. "The atmospheric pressure can't drop this fast. This isn't meteorologically logical." But the mountain was not concerned with logic. Sergei, shielding his face with his hands, leaned towards Victor. "We have to go back, Victor," he yelled. "This isn't a storm. The mountain doesn't want us." Victor's face was covered in the snow blown by the wind. He squinted and looked towards the summit. The peak was now lost like a ghost in the swirling snow and clouds. He hesitated for a moment. Ivan's face, those giant tracks, the sound from last night, they all merged in his mind. But to turn back, to give up after coming so close, was unthinkable. "Forward!" he shouted, his voice barely audible in the wind. "We'll take shelter at the nearest cliff. We'll set up camp there. Move!" The team reluctantly obeyed their leader's command, but they were no longer on an expedition. They were unwelcome guests, walking on an angry giant. Victor's command was instantly swallowed by the howl of the wind, but the team moved as one. They no longer had the luxury of dwelling on their individual fears. Survival depended on them acting like a single organism. They bowed their heads, shielding their faces from the relentless assault of ice crystals, and began to move towards the indistinct dark shape of the rocks Victor had pointed to. The climb was no longer an expedition, but a blind escape. The wind was not just a cold air current. It was as if it had a personal hatred, targeting each of them individually, increasing its intensity at their weakest moments to throw them off balance. The snow rose from the ground and hit their faces like a horizontal curtain, reducing visibility to a few meters. The world was a swirling white chaos, and they were 7 small dots lost within it. In the midst of this physical struggle, a more insidious and disturbing feeling began to creep into each of their minds. The feeling of being watched had taken on a much different form than the vague unease in the forest. They were now being watched not just by the mountain itself, but by something moving within the storm, climbing with them. When Dmitri lost his balance and fell for a moment, he could have sworn he saw a tall, dark silhouette appear for an instant in the snowstorm about 50 meters above him. It was not human-shaped. It was more like an unnaturally tall figure wearing a cloak that billowed in the wind. When he blinked, the silhouette was gone. He dismissed it as a trick of the storm and his fatigue, but the icy feeling of fear that pierced his heart did not go away. Similarly, Sergei thought he noticed fast, shadowy movements passing right by, their tracks from behind, but leaving no trace on the snow. These shadows could have been momentary darkness created by the storm, but his instincts told him they were living, conscious beings accompanying them. Alina, on the other hand, was experiencing what challenged her scientific mind the most. Within the howl of the wind, she began to hear something else besides that sorrowful melodic sound. It was a whisper, a rhythmic and insistent whisper in an incomprehensible language. It was as if the storm was trying to tell them something, to shout a secret or a curse into their ears. No one spoke of what they saw or heard. In the midst of such madness, they could not be sure that their own minds were not playing tricks on them. But these unshared experiences, instead of strengthening the bond between them, trapped each of them in their own personal nightmare. They were now fighting not only the storm, but also their own sanity. Finally, when they reached the hollow of the dark rocks Victor had pointed to, almost crawling, they all collapsed onto the snow in exhaustion. The wind howled like a monster around the rocks, but at least they were protected from its direct blows. But that shelter gave them no peace, because they knew now. The storm was not just a weather event. The storm had come to hunt them. And they were right in the middle of the trap. The hollow in the rocks had offered them a momentary refuge from the storm's most brutal blows, but it was not a salvation. It was merely a postponed end. The wind howled like a monster as it passed around the rocks, each gust seeming to feed on their fears. The team lay exhausted on the snow, huddled together. No one spoke. The same images were playing in everyone's mind. That tall, dark silhouette that appeared and disappeared in the snow. Those fast shadows that danced on the snow without leaving a trace. Those incomprehensible, rhythmic whispers woven into the wind. They could no longer dismiss them as hallucinations. There was something else on the mountain with them, and this thing was hostile. As the hours passed, the storm, instead of subsiding, grew even more violent. The temperature had dropped unbearably, and the first signs of hypothermia, uncontrolled shivering and numb fingertips, had begun to appear. Victor knew they couldn't stay in this shelter any longer. Turning back was impossible. The path they had come from was now lost in a swirling hell of snow. Moving forward was suicide. There was only one option left, the one that broke the most. Fundamental rule of mountaineering, the one that was avoided even in the most desperate moments: to set up camp in the middle of a storm, on such an open and exposed slope of the mountain. "We're setting up the tent," Victor shouted, using all his strength to make his voice heard over the wind. "Here, now." This command seemed like madness to the rest of the team. Sergei looked at him in disbelief. Here? Victor, that's suicide. The wind will tear the tent to shreds in seconds. Victor grabbed Sergei by the collar, his eyes flashing with anger and desperation. Do we have another choice? He yelled. Is it better to freeze to death? At least we'll have some shelter. Now help me. This harsh outburst snapped the team out of their stupor. They understood the futility of arguing. With mechanical movements, they took out the single large expedition tent from their backpacks. The process of setting up the tent turned into a nightmare. The wind tried to snatch the orange fabric from their hands, fighting them as if it were a living being. The fabric billowed like a sail, threatening to drag them down the mountain. Their fingers grew numb as they tried to drive the tent pegs into the frozen ground, each hammer blow lost in the howl of the wind. In the midst of this chaos, Elena thought the whispers of the wind were now clearer, as if someone were giving them instructions. Dmitri, on the other hand, saw the image of the tall, dark silhouette every time he closed his eyes. Finally, after nearly an hour of superhuman effort, they managed to get the tent up. It was tattered and leaning to one side, but it was standing. One by one, they threw themselves inside, exhausted. When Victor pulled the zipper all the way up, the roar of the storm outside instantly turned into a muffled hum. The inside was pitch black, cold, and cramped. But the most terrifying thing was the sudden silence. The chaos outside had given way to a claustrophobic, tense weight inside this fabric shelter. They had not escaped the storm. They had only trapped themselves in this small orange coffin in the heart of the mountain. And they all knew that the thing outside was waiting for the right moment to come in. The inside of the tent was darker and colder than a tomb. The roar of the storm outside was a muffled, constant moan through the orange fabric. 7 bodies were huddled in the cramped space, seeking warmth from one another, but also feeling each other's fear. The air was so thick with their condensed breath that it was almost tangible. The only light source was the failing, flickering headlamp on Alana's head. The light created giant, distorted shadows that danced on the ceiling of the tent, seeming to come alive and retreat with every breath. No one was speaking. There was nothing left to say. There was only the sound of the storm and the irregular, fearful beating of 7 human hearts. Elena was bent over the small, leather-bound journal in her lap, her freezing fingers struggling to hold the pen. Writing was a sanctuary for her, a way to control the chaos by putting it into words, to fit the incomprehensible into a logical frame. But this time, the words were failing her. Day 18, she wrote, her letters shaky and crooked. The barometer must be broken. There is no other explanation. The atmospheric pressure dropped at a rate that cannot be explained by any recorded natural event. The storm came upon us not like a weather event, but like a conscious assault. There's a pattern in the sound of the wind, a repeating whisper. Sergei says it is the language of the mountain. I want to believe it is an acoustic resonance, an anomaly created by the shape of the rocks. But I cannot deceive myself. Her pen paused for a moment. She lifted her eyes and looked at the others in the tent. They were no longer the people she knew. Sergei was silently murmuring an old prayer in the corner. Dmitri was shaking in his sleeping bag, a tremor that was clearly not just from the cold. And Victor, their always rock-solid leader, was sitting with his back to her, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the weight of the burden he was carrying. Elena returned to her journal. I cannot explain the tracks either. And that sound, that sorrowful, thin sound in the forest. We are not alone on this mountain. This is no longer a scientific doubt, but a truth I feel in my bones. Ivan's words are stuck in my mind. That silence is more dangerous than the loudest storm. We have not reached that silence yet. But I do not even want to think about what awaits us when the storm subsides. This is not an expedition. This is a struggle for survival. And I think we are losing. These may be my last notes. If anyone finds this journal ... She could not finish her sentence. Because at that exact moment, a completely different sound was heard, overpowering the roar of the storm. It was not the sound of the wind. It was a slow, rhythmic scraping sound, coming from right outside the tent, from the surface of the fabric. It was as if someone was drawing a circle on the fabric with a long, sharp nail. Slowly, patiently, as if looking for a way in. Everyone inside the tent held their breath, frozen, their attention locked on that sound. The storm had stopped. But the horror outside was just beginning. That slow, rhythmic scraping sound cut through the frozen air inside the tent like a knife. 7. People turned into 7 statues. No one breathed, no one moved. The flickering light from Elena's headlamp reflected in everyone's wide, terrified eyes, which were locked on the thin fabric of the tent, the direction the sound was coming from. The sound was methodical and patient. It was not the sound of an animal in panic or curiosity. It was a conscious, intelligent act that declared its intent. It was as if whatever was outside knew they were inside, listening in terror, and was savoring the moment. Dmitri, inside his sleeping bag, covered his mouth to stifle a silent scream, his eyes filled with tears of fear. Sergei's prayerful murmurs had ceased, his lips parted. After about a minute of this torture, which felt like a century, the scraping sound suddenly stopped. But the ensuing silence brought no relief, because this was not a silence filled with the muffled roar of the storm. This was an absolute silence. The wind outside had stopped. The snowfall had ceased. It was as if the mountain was holding its breath, and in the midst of this unnatural silence, a new sound began. It was less a sound and more a vibration. A low-frequency hum coming from the depths of the earth, a hum they felt in every cell of their bodies. The metal poles of the tent were vibrating slightly. The mats on the snow were trembling. This was a sound made by the mountain itself. As if a giant creature was waking up, stretching, the hum slowly rose. And then, just like the scraping sound, it suddenly stopped. And in that moment, that voice spoke. It was not the whisper of the wind. It was a clear, calm voice, right next to the tent, as if someone had leaned into the fabric to speak. It had a metallic, echoing quality that could not be defined as either male or female. The language it spoke was not of this world. It was an ancient language, a mixture of guttural, hard consonants and long, vibrating vowels. The voice was not angry or threatening. On the contrary, it was monotonous and emotionless, as if it were reading a list, performing a ritual, or perhaps counting names. 7 names. As this incomprehensible but hypnotic monologue continued, Victor slowly moved his hand to the hilt of his ice axe. His eyes were fixed on the direction the voice was coming from, his muscles tensed. He knew he had to do something as the leader, but what could he do? This thing outside defied the laws of nature. Just then, a sob that Dmitri had been trying to suppress tore through the silence with a muffled sound. The voice outside fell silent instantly. In that moment, time stopped for everyone inside the tent. The thing had heard the sob. It knew they were there now. After a few seconds of unbearable anticipation, the fabric of the tent, right where Dmitri's back was resting, slowly began to press inward. In the light of Elena's lamp, the shape of a hand appeared on the fabric, but this was not a human hand. Its fingers were nearly twice as long and thin as a human's, with joints that seemed to bend in the wrong places, and most terrifyingly, at the tips of the fingers were not nails, but small, dark points that pierced the fabric. The hand paused on the fabric for a moment, as if tasting the fear inside, and then slowly withdrew. disappearing into the darkness at the moment the shadow of that unnatural hand retreated from the fabric. The silence that fell inside the tent was even heavier than the absolute silence outside. It was the frozen, crystallized form of fear. No one dared to look at Dmitri. He was the one the hand had touched, the one the entity had chosen. The young man sat with his back still against the fabric wall, his eyes fixed on an empty space. In a catatonic state, his body was trembling, but this was no longer from the cold. It was an uncontrollable tremor coming from the depths of his soul. When Elena's headlamp shone on Dmitri's face, they saw that his skin had turned as pale as wax and his lips were parted to form a silent word. But no sound came out. In that moment, the thin bond of trust and camaraderie within the team snapped. They were no longer a team of 7. They were 7 strangers trapped in the same snare, feeding on each other's fear. Sergei's prayers were no longer a refuge, but a delirium. He was whispering the same words over and over, faster and more meaninglessly. Elena was trying to cling to the last ramparts of her scientific mind. Mass hysteria, she thought. Altitude, lack of oxygen, stress. Our brains are playing tricks on us. But her fingers were trembling so much that she knew she would not be able to open her journal again. What she had seen was not a hallucination. The faint, damp impression the hand had left on the fabric was there. Victor was gripping the hilt of his ice axe so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He had to do something as the leader. He had to calm his team, make a plan. But only one image was replaying in his mind, those long, thin fingers. This thing could tear this fragile shelter of nylon and aluminum to shreds at any moment. Why wasn't it doing so? Why was it playing with them? The thought was more terrifying than a physical attack. This was a predator playing with its prey. And they were trapped in this mountain's hunting ground. The silence was broken by a muffled, guttural sound from Dmitri's throat. It was not a sob or a scream. It was more like the pained sound an animal makes as it takes its last breath. Then, he suddenly jumped to his feet. His eyes were still blank, but his body was moving with a primal panic. "It's inside," he shouted, his voice high-pitched and fragile. "It's inside. Don't you see it?" He was pointing at the shadows on the ceiling of the tent. "It's walking among us." These words snapped the last thread in the already tense atmosphere. Mass panic spread like a virus. Everyone began to see the entity in the shadows inside the tent, in the folds of the sleeping bags, in each other's faces. The cramped space was no longer a shelter, but a trap. The unknown horror outside was better than this claustrophobic madness inside. Someone, it was impossible to tell who, screamed. And that scream was like a signal flare. There was no more logic, no more training, only the instinct to escape. Victor, with his ice axe, struck not at the zipper of the tent's door, but directly at the fabric. Sergei was trying to cut a hole in the wall closest to him with a knife. Everyone was desperately trying to get out of this fabric prison, this den of madness. It didn't matter what was outside. To stay inside meant to lose one's mind. The moment Dmitri's cry of "it's inside" tore through the fragile sanity within the tent, the absolute silence outside was shattered with equal violence. This was not the return of the storm. It was something far worse. A rumble came from beneath. The ground, from the depths of the frozen earth and rock, and the ground where they had camped, shook violently. It was not like an earthquake. It was a single, powerful, rolling motion, like a giant creature turning in its sleep. Everything inside the tent was thrown into the air. Sleeping bags, mats, empty water bottles, and Elena's fallen journal hung suspended for a moment in that instant of weightlessness. The team members tumbled on top of each other. The tense metal poles bent with a painful groan, and the fabric made a high-pitched sound like the tearing of taut skin. The tremor stopped as suddenly as it had begun, but its effect had been devastating. This physical shock had completed the psychological collapse that Dmitri had started. No one was thinking rationally anymore. Their training, their experience, everything they had learned in mountains over the years, had been wiped from their minds by that single jolt. All that remained was the most primal, most animalistic instinct. Flee. This shelter was no longer a shelter. It was a tomb. And inside that tomb, with them, was something else. Dmitri's screams were no longer composed of words, but had devolved into meaningless, terrified sounds. His eyes were locked on a point on the ceiling of the tent, and he was waving his arms in the air as if defending himself against something hanging there that no one else could see. This sight broke the last resistance of the others. Victor was no longer a leader. He too was a frightened man. Without a moment's thought, he swung the ice axe in his hand not at the door, but at the nearest wall of the tent, right next to Sergei's head. The axe tore through the nylon fabric like a mullen, and the blinding whiteness from outside seeped in like a dagger. The cold air briefly dissipated the suffocating atmosphere of fear inside, but it brought no relief. This was merely the opening of the trap's door. Sergei didn't even react to Victor's savage move. He too had drawn his own knife and was desperately trying to pierce the floor of the tent, as if something was about to emerge from underneath. Elena, with the last vestiges of her scientific mind, tried to analyze the situation, if only for a moment. An avalanche? A landslide? She thought. But there was neither the roar of a mass of snow nor the sound of a slide around them. Only that tremor and the unnatural silence that followed. Then, as she looked out through the tear Victor had made, her blood ran cold at what she saw. The sky was no longer dark. On the horizon, behind the mountain's peak, a strange, silent light was glowing, flickering in shades of orange and green, like the lights of a city, but much brighter. This was neither a dawn nor an aurora. It was an unnatural, incomprehensible illumination. And under that light, the slopes of the mountain were not white as they should have been, but were covered in moving, swarming shadows. She understood then. The tremor was an invitation to come outside, and the light outside had raised the curtain on the stage. The gash Victor had torn with his ice axe was not an escape route, but a window into madness. The unnatural orange-green light from outside flooded the tent, bathing everything in a surreal color. This light made the shadows inside even darker, elongating them into monstrous forms. And it was not just light that poured through the hole. It was the mountain's icy, sharp breath, a breath that seemed to have a consciousness of its own. This breath brought with it that incomprehensible, rhythmic whisper. It was no longer mixed with the wind, but was direct, clear, and right in their ears. In the midst of this chaos, it was Sergei who moved first. With an animal instinct, he lunged for the tier Victor had made. He no longer cared about the team or the mission. All he wanted was to get out of this fabric tomb. When he reached the tier, he tried to widen it with his frozen hands and stuck his head out. But the next moment, he threw himself back with a scream of pain. His face was bright, red as if seared by an invisible flame, and his eyes were wide with terror. "Close it," he shouted. "Close the hole. The light is burning." No one understood what he meant. The air outside was freezing cold. It was impossible for something to burn. But as Sergei writhed on the ground, clutching his face, Victor approached the tier and cautiously looked out. What he saw was terrifying, enough to make him forget Sergei's pain. There was no snowstorm outside, no wind, only that silent, pulsating light and the countless swarming shadows on the snow. And worst of all, the snow around the tent was slowly rising, as if being pulled upward by some force, forming a wall that was sealing the very tier Victor had made. This was not a snowdrift, it was a conscious act. The mountain was instantly closing every escape route they opened. Victor pulled back in horror. "The door!" he shouted. "Try the zipper." Elena was the only one who heard the command. She crawled to the main entrance of the tent and grabbed the metal pull of the zipper. But the zipper didn't move an inch. It was as if the metal had been welded into a single piece. "It's frozen," Elena called out. But this was not a normal freeze. When Elena touched the fabric around the zipper with her fingertips, she felt that the fabric too had become as hard as stone, having lost all its flexibility. It was as if, through some rapid process of fossilization, that part of the tent had become a part of the mountain itself. They all understood then. The tremor was not just to scare them. It was the move that set the final piece of the trap. It had sealed them, along with their tent, into the frozen ground. Every hole they made was instantly repaired, every escape attempt rendered impossible. This tent was no longer a shelter or a piece of camping gear. It was a living cage, designed specifically for them. And the walls of that cage were slowly closing in on them. They were no longer afraid of the horror outside, but of the fabric. Prison they were in, because there was no way out. There was no way out. As this realization echoed simultaneously in the minds of 7 people, the last bastion of humanity, reason, gave way to the most primal instinct, the blind panic of a trapped animal. They no longer cared about the light outside or the swarming shadows. The only enemy was this orange fabric that was suffocating them, closing in on them. This was no longer their tent. It was a stomach the mountain was using to swallow them, and they had to get out before they were digested alive. It was Victor who moved first. His leadership instinct had given way to a pure, savage desire for survival. He was no longer swinging his ice axe at a specific target. In a fit of madness, he was striking the walls, the ceiling, every point he could reach. With each blow, the sound of tearing fabric turned into a high-pitched, ear-splitting scream, like the skinning of a beast. Sergei had stopped writhing on the ground and had also drawn his knife, imitating Victor, piercing the fabric over and over. His knife strikes were erratic and desperate. His goal was not to open an exit, but simply to inflict pain on this prison. In the midst of this chaos, Elena's scientific mind flared one last time. She acted not with blind rage, but with calculated desperation. She reached into her pack and pulled out the flare gun. Her intention was not to call for help. There was no one to help. Her intention was to burn this living cage from the inside. Without hesitation, she pulled the trigger. The red flare exploded inside the cramped tent, releasing a horrific light and heat. The nylon fabric instantly caught fire. As the flames climbed like snakes towards the ceiling of the tent, a sharp, toxic smoke filled the interior. This was the beginning of the end. They were now fleeing not just from claustrophobia, but also from the flames and the suffocating smoke. Dmitri, snapped out of his catatonic state, was reaching his hands towards the burning fabric with empty eyes reflecting the flames. It was as if the fire was a salvation calling to him. The team was no longer a team. They were a panicked mass of bodies, pushing each other, screaming, trying to escape a burning trap. Finally, the combination of Victor's and Sergei's blows and the fire Elena had started caused one of the tent's walls to collapse completely. As burning, melting pieces of fabric rained down on them, they threw themselves out through the resulting tier. The freezing cold air hit their burning skin like a whip. Their eyes were blinded by the unnatural orange-green light outside after the darkness inside the tent. One by one, stumbling, coughing, and screaming, they threw themselves onto the snow. Behind them, there was no longer a tent, but a skeletal structure of molten plastic and bent metal, still smoldering. They had escaped. They had been freed from the fabric prison. But the place they had thrown themselves into was not a salvation, but merely the next and final chamber of the trap. Now, under that silent, pulsating light, in the midst of the swarming shadows, they were completely defenseless on the bare slope of the mountain. And the thing that had invited them in no longer had to be patient. When they threw themselves from the wreckage of the burning tent, they had fallen from one hell into another. On one side, they had left behind the toxic smoke of melting nylon and the scorching heat of the flames. On the other, the mountains. Freezing cold stabbed their burned skin like 1,000 needles of ice, but the worst part was the silence and the light. The unnatural green-orange glow in the sky washed over the snow-covered slope with a surreal brilliance, like a dreamscape. Under this light, every snowflake glittered like a shard of glass, dazzling their eyes. And the shadows were no longer just dark patches. Behind every rock, every mound of snow touched by the light, they pulsed slowly and rhythmically, as if they were alive. The team was no longer a team. They were 7 wounded animals, awakened from the same nightmare, but fleeing in different directions: companionship, trust, leadership. It was all left among the ashes of the burning tent. Now there was only pure, primal fear. Victor tried to stand, wanting to shout for them to regroup with the last remnants of his leadership instinct. "Group," he whispered, but his voice was nothing more than a rasp from his throat. "Don't scatter." But no one heard him. Everyone was a prisoner of their own personal terror. Dmitri was the first to break away. There was no expression of fear or pain on his face, only a blank, hypnotized stare. His eyes were locked on the source of the strange light emanating from behind the summit. It was as if the light was a siren whispering his name. He stumbled to his feet and, without a word, began to walk uphill, directly towards the light. His clothes were partially burned, his hands were bare, but he seemed to feel neither the cold nor the pain. He just moved with mechanical steps towards. That call. His action triggered a chain reaction in the others. Sergei began to run in the opposite direction of Dmitri, downhill, towards the darkness of the forest. He was not running from the light and the shadows. He was running from the mountain itself. "It won't let us go," he shouted. "It will swallow us." His screams echoed in the silence and faded away. Elena froze for a moment. Her scientific mind rejected everything she was seeing, but her body was screaming. Then she began to run, not up or down, but towards the steepest part of the slope, towards the cliff at the side. Perhaps jumping was better than surrendering to this unknown horror. Victor stared at his scattered team, at his shattered mission. Who should he follow? Who could he save? But then, on the snow right in front of him, he saw one of the swarming shadows slowly solidify, rise from the ground, and transform into that familiar, unnaturally tall, cloaked silhouette. In that moment, Victor also began to run. But he was not running in any one direction. He was just running in a blind panic, zigzagging to escape the thing behind him. 7 small figures on the vast white stage, illuminated by that unsettling light, scattered in different directions, disappearing into the darkness, each to meet their own end. Behind them, only a burning wreck and the silent, waiting echo of the mountain remained. Sergei ran, his lungs burning with the icy air, downhill towards the dark sanctuary the forest promised. The unnatural light behind him cast his own panicked shadow before him like a giant monster on the snow. With every step, this shadow seemed to reach out to catch him. He was not running from the light. He was running from the mountain itself, from that all-seeing, all-knowing consciousness. The forest was the last hope for a place that civilization, life, and most importantly, that terrifying light in the sky could not reach. When he reached the tree line, He threw himself among the branches and the darkness without a moment's hesitation. When he looked back, he saw that the unsettling glow was being filtered by the dense weave of the trees, losing its power. For a moment, just for a moment, he thought he might be safe, but this was just another act in the mountains' play. The inside of the forest was not the sanctuary he had expected. The trees were not standing as they should. Their trunks seemed to be slowly shifting, closing the path behind him as he passed. The sound of the wind as it passed through the branches once again turned into that sorrowful, melodic whisper. Sergei had lost his way. Whichever direction he went, he came across the same imposing moss-covered rock or the same old pine tree, whose branches were intertwined like the fingers of a skeleton. The forest was slowly swallowing him, drawing him into the depths of its own labyrinth. His body was at its breaking point. His clothes, partially melted from the fire in the tent, exposed his bare skin to the freezing cold. Hypothermia began to cloud his mind, to slow his movements. With the last remnants of his survival instinct, he knew he had to stop and build a fire. Fire meant warmth. Fire meant light. And most importantly, fire was a weapon against the things that lurked in the darkness. He took shelter in the wind-protected hollow of a giant fallen pine tree and tried to get his lighter and dry tinder from his pack with his frozen fingers. After a long and painful effort, a small flame flickered to life. Sergei desperately fed every dry branch and piece of kindling he could find to this fragile flame. The fire grew reluctantly, illuminating a small area around him with a flickering orange light. This small circle of light and warmth instilled a momentary hope in Sergei's frozen soul. But this hope was short-lived. No matter how much he fed the fire, it would not grow strong. The flames danced lazily and weakly, as if the air around them was suffocating them. Then, with a sound from the depths of the forest, the flames of the fire flickered and almost went out. It was not the sound of an animal's footsteps. It was the sound of something heavy and wet being dragged over the snow. Sergei froze. The sound was slowly approaching. In the darkness just beyond the circle of light from the fire, something was standing. He couldn't see it, but he could feel its presence. The pure, primal cold emanating from that presence was swallowing the meager warmth of the fire. In fear, Sergei threw another handful of branches into the fire. The flames flared for a moment, and in that instant, he saw something in the darkness. Not a face, not a form. Just a pulsing, lightless darkness rising from the ground. And as that darkness approached, the flames of the fire shrank, weakened, and with a final flicker and a hissing sound, they went out completely. Sergei was left alone in the absolute darkness and in the presence of that icy being. The last sound from the forest was his muffled, hopeless scream. As Sergei's final scream echoed and died in the mountain silence, the others were facing their own fates. Dmitri continued his stumbling climb towards that hypnotic green-orange light like a pilgrim. Cold, pain, fear, he felt nothing. His mind was filled with the monotonous metallic voice emanating from that light, a voice only he could hear. The voice was making him promises. The promise of knowledge, of the secrets of the universe, and of salvation from this ice hell. When Dmitri reached a ridge just below the summit, he saw the source of the light. It was not a natural phenomenon, or anything man-made. It was a massive geometric structure, hovering in the air above the snow. It was constantly changing shape, folding into itself at impossible angles, and its surface rippled with those green and orange colors like a living sky. In the very center of the structure was a pitch-black void, and that voice, that call, was coming from that void. Without a moment's hesitation, Dmitri opened his arms and took his final step towards that void, and the light silently swallowed him and vanished out at the same moments. Elena had also reached the edge of the cliff on the side of the slope. She paused for a moment and looked down into the bottomless darkness. Jumping seemed like an escape from this madness. But then, in a corner of her mind, the stubborn spark of her scientific curiosity flared. Before she died, she wanted to understand. She turned back and looked at the mountain slope. She saw Dmitri disappear into the light, saw the forest where Sergei had run fall into an unsettling silence. And then, she saw Victor. Their leader was no longer running. He was kneeling on the snow, his head in his hands. And around him, those swarming shadows were beginning to gather. They were no longer just shadows. They were slowly taking form. Those tall, cloaked silhouettes were rising from within the snow, their numbers growing. Dozens, perhaps hundreds. Of them, all silently approaching Victor. In horror, Alina understood what this meant. These beings were the mountain itself. They were the echoes of countless creatures that had died on this summit, their souls absorbed by this mountain. And now they had awakened to harvest new souls. With a final act of defiance, Alina pulled the flare gun from her pack again. This time, her intention was not to burn, but to illuminate. She fired the flare towards the place where the shadows were gathering. The red light tore through the night for a moment and revealed the true face of those beings. They had no faces. Under their cloaks was only a billowing, starless void of night. But the light of the flare seemed to cause them pain. They all recoiled with a silent, pained scream. Alina had stopped them, if only for a moment. But then, she felt the snow beneath her feet tremble. The edge of the cliff began to crack as if being undermined from below. The last thing she saw was Victor lifting his head from where he was kneeling to look at her, and one of those shadow beings, gliding directly towards her with incredible speed. The snow gave way beneath her feet, and with a final scream, Alina fell into the void. Three weeks later, when no word had been received from the Northern Echo expedition, an experienced search and rescue team set out from the village of USV and reached the last known campsite on the mountain slope. The scene that greeted them was unlike anything they had seen in their years in the mountains. This was not the kind of destruction left by an avalanche or a savage storm. It was a more personal, more incomprehensible, and more disturbing scene. The weather was clear, the sun was reflecting brightly on the snow, and there was an absolute grave-like silence all around. Not even the wind was blowing. It was as if the mountain, after committing a crime, had erased the evidence and cloaked itself in an innocent silence. The team's leader, an old hunter named Anton, froze at the sight. In the middle of it all stood the remains of the large expedition tent that had once housed 7 people. But the tent had not been torn apart by the wind. It was as if it had exploded from the inside, as if it had been ripped to shreds by a wild animal. The nylon fabric was torn in nonsensical places, with sharp knife-like slashes and brute force. The metal poles were bent at impossible angles, as if twisted by a giant hand. And strangest of all, one wall of the tent had melted into a black, amorphous pool of plastic on the snow, as if from intense heat. Anton knelt in the snow and examined the melted remains. "A flare," he murmured to the man next to him. "They fired it inside the tent. Why? For God's sake, why?" The rest of the campsite was just as strange. The backpacks were neatly lined up, as if their owners would be back any moment. The water bottles, the sleeping bags, they were all there. Next to one, there was even a journal, left open, with a pen beside it. But the people were gone. Not a body, not a drop of blood, not a sign of a struggle. Just the silent, abandoned equipment and a shattered shelter. It was as if 7 people had simply evaporated from within their clothes. A young man from the rescue team noticed something in the snow a little way from the tent's wreckage. "Anton, look here," he called out. Anton and the others gathered where the young man pointed. An ice axe was sticking out of the snow, but the axe was not just lying there. Its sharp point was driven almost halfway into the frozen ground and rock, as if it had been swung with incredible force. It took several men pulling together to get it out. This was not something a normal person could do. This was the work of pure, primal terror or of superhuman rage. Anton straightened up, the heavy ice axe in his hand, and looked at the crushing silence around him. He didn't know what had happened here, but he knew one thing. Something so terrifying had happened on this mountain that night that it had made 7 experienced mountaineers tear their tent from the inside and flee into the freezing cold, leaving their gear behind. And that something was still out here, somewhere. Anton, holding the strangely embedded ice axe, scanned the snow-covered surface that stretched from the campsite down to the tree line. At first glance, the snow appeared untouched. But on closer inspection, he noticed faint depressions under the surface, almost completely erased by the wind and new snow. They were footprints, but there was something strange about these tracks. They were not the deep, scattered tracks a person would leave while running in a panic. They were more orderly, spaced at regular intervals, as if they had walked with slow, methodical steps. And most horrifyingly, most of the tracks belonged to someone who was barefoot or wearing only socks. In this freezing cold, who would leave their boots and warm clothes behind to walk, almost naked, to their death? "Spread out," Anton commanded, his voice cracking like a whip in the silence. "Follow the tracks, but be careful. Stay in pairs and do not separate." The team, reluctantly but with discipline, began to descend the slope, following those ghostly tracks. The tracks did not lead them in a single direction, but to different points. It was as if the team had deliberately scattered after leaving the tent, each going their own way to meet their end. The first body they found belonged to Sergei, lying at the very edge of the tree line under a giant pine tree. His face was buried in the snow, his back to the sky. He was wearing only a thin base layer. There were no wounds or signs of a struggle on his body. He had simply frozen. But when Anton turned the body over, he saw that Sergei's face did not have the calm expression that comes with freezing. His eyes were wide open with the purest, most primal terror he had ever seen, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. As if in his final moment, he had seen something too horrific for the mind to comprehend. It didn't take them long to find the other bodies. They were frozen in strange positions, hundreds of meters apart from each other. They found Alina at the bottom of a ravine, looking up at the sky in a final act of defiance. Dmitri was found closest to the summit, buried in the snow with a senseless, almost peaceful smile on his face. But the most disturbing discovery was Victor. Their leader was found in a more sheltered hollow. However, his body was not like the others. His rib cage was crushed, as if by an incredible pressure applied from the inside out. But there was not a single scratch, not a single bruise on his skin. His bones seemed to have been pulverized under his skin. And when Anton opened Victor's mouth, he saw that his tongue was missing. It was gone cleanly, as if removed in a surgical operation. That day at sunset, Anton stood over the 6 bodies they had found. One person was missing. And each of the 6 bodies found raised far more questions than answers. What had these people seen? What was it that had terrified them so much, that had broken their bones without tearing their skin, that had cut out their tongues? Anton looked at the silent summit, painted red by the last light of the setting sun. And he understood. Then, this was not just a mountain that disliked visitors. This was a mountain that hunted. And that night, its hunt had been successful. Night fell over the mountain like an icy shroud. After moving the 6 bodies they had found to a temporarily sheltered place, Anton and his team set up their own camp far below that cursed spot, in the presumed safety of the deep forest. No one spoke around the campfire. The same images were in everyone's mind. Sergei's terrified face, Victor's incomprehensible injuries, those barefoot tracks in the snow. The silence was broken by a small leather-bound notebook held by one of the team's younger members. It was Elena's journal, which they had found at the campsite. Anton took the journal and, in the flickering light of the fire, opened the last page with his frozen fingers. Elena's final notes were less the observations of a scientist and more the last screams of a soul on the brink of madness. Her letters danced across the page, the ink smudged in places, as if her hand had been trembling violently as she wrote. Double quotes. The mountain has sealed us in. This is a cage. The light outside, my God, that light. It's not natural. It animates the shadows. I see them. They are moving. They are tall. They have no faces, only emptiness. Victor struck with the axe. Sergei with the knife. But there is no escape. The fire, it's the only way. To burn it from the inside. To wake up, if this is a dream. To leave proof, if it is real. They are hunting us. They are whispering our names. That voice is everywhere. This mountain is hungry, and we are its meal. I am firing the flare. The door is collapsing. We are outside. But we are not saved. The cage has just changed. The writing ended abruptly there. The rest of the page was blank. Anton slowly closed the journal. These notes did not explain what had happened. They only offered a map of insanity. What had these people encountered? What unimaginable horror had forced them to burn their own shelter, to flee into a certain death by freezing? And the seventh climber, what had happened to him? His body was never found. Perhaps the mountain had kept one as proof. The next morning, the team began their silent and somber descent. When they returned to the village of Usv, they were met by the same silent, waiting faces. When Ivan looked into Anton's eyes, he didn't need to ask any questions. He saw the answer in the empty, tired expression on Anton's face. Even years later, the silent summit remained a mystery. The official reports closed the case as an avalanche and a case of mass hysteria. But those who went to that mountain, those who were there that night, knew the truth. For the rest of his life, Anton would sometimes hear a voice from that mountain. In his dreams, it was not the sound of the wind. It was a sound in 7 different tones, sorrowful yet melodic, echoing in an endless loop. It was as if the mountain was using the final screams of the souls it had swallowed as a lullaby to call its new guests, because the mountain was hunting. And it was always hungry.